You already know these 10 distilleries: Woodford Reserve, Four Roses. The problem isn't that you have bad taste in bourbon. The problem is that you're buying the wrong bottle from the right brand. You go into a liquor store, see a legendary brand, and hunt for the allocated release. You pay secondary market prices that make no sense. You think you're making an educated decision? You're not. The standard bottles sitting 3 feet away are often better, cheaper, and more reliable than the allocated ones people are fighting over. Bartenders reach for them. Distillery workers drink them. They're consistent. They're the foundation. Today, I'm walking through 10 bourbon distilleries and telling you exactly which bottle to buy and which one to skip, because there's a massive difference between what collectors chase and what professionals actually drink. Subscribe and stick around. Let's dig into the most reliable bottles from the best bourbon distilleries in America. Let's start with something people chase harder than anything else, and that's allocation. W.L. Weller is the wheated bourbon, which means high corn content and wheated mash bills with no rye in the profile, creating a soft, approachable palate. People have built entire collections around this brand. William LaRue Weller is the holy grail. It's uncut, unfiltered, barrel-proof, and produced in tiny quantities. It's allocated, it's rare, and the secondary market for William LaRue has made it an absolute status symbol. Bottles that retailed for $60 are now selling for $1,200 on the secondary market. But here's what you need to understand. William LaRue Weller is the exception, not the rule. It's the single-barrel masterpiece that gets pulled from a distillery's vault. It's not the brand, it's the celebration. By W.L. Weller, Special Reserve instead. This is the actual wheated bourbon that built Buffalo Trace's reputation in the wheated bourbon category. It's $70 to $80. You can find it almost anywhere, and it tastes like soft, polished Kentucky bourbon done absolutely correctly. The mash bill is wheated, the aging is patient, the consistency is unshakable, and the flavor profile is vanilla, caramel, soft oak with no sharp edges. It works beautifully in cocktails, it works neat, and it works as the perfect introduction to what wheated bourbon actually tastes like. Bartenders reach for W.L. Weller Special Reserve when someone orders a wheated bourbon that won't disappoint. Meanwhile, collectors are still hunting William LaRue in Facebook groups at 3 in the morning. A bottle that costs $70 and has been doing the exact same thing for decades is more valuable than a bottle that costs $1,200 just because it happened to be rare one particular year. Start with the Special Reserve. Understand what the wheated profile actually means, and then if William LaRue ever finds its way into your hands at reasonable pricing, you'll know it's special because you understand the foundation it's built on. Old Forester is the oldest bourbon brand still in continuous production in America, and that's not a marketing slogan, that's a fact. The brand has existed since 1864, and George Garvin Brown put his signature on every single bottle, which is why you still see it on shelves today. That signature means something real. It means a distillery that's been making the same brand for 160 years and hasn't disappeared, hasn't been discontinued during Prohibition, hasn't been shut down by anything. People see Old Forester and immediately hunt for the allocated release like the 1920 Prohibition style or the 1910 old-fashioned recipe. These bottles are special edition, limited release, and the pricing climbs every year. They taste excellent, absolutely, but they're not what built Old Forester's reputation. Buy Old Forester 100 proof instead, and there's a very good reason. This is the bottle that bartenders actually stock in their bars. 100 proof means it brings enough heat to mix with other ingredients, but enough smoothness to sip on its own. It's been the same consistent expression since the brand began its modern era, and the flavor profile is vanilla, butterscotch, black cherry, baking spices, and charred oak. The mouthfeel is slightly thin, but the flavors punch through hard and clear. This is what premium bourbon tastes like when a distillery prioritizes consistency over innovation or gimmicks. Old Forester 100 proof is the bottle that if you gave someone a blind tasting, they would describe as perfect bourbon. Not exotic, not innovative, just perfectly executed American bourbon that knows exactly what it's supposed to be and does it without apology or hesitation. Bartenders use it for old fashions because it stands up to vermouth and bitters without getting lost in the mix. They use it for whiskey sours because the spice comes through clean. They use it for neat pours when someone asks for solid bourbon that won't disappoint. The allocated bottles are Old Forester showing what they're capable of when they really want to. The 100 proof is them showing what they're committed to every single day, and that commitment is worth far more than any exception. Wilderness Trail is the new school distillery that's doing old school bourbon the right way. They opened in 2017, and here's what makes them different. They didn't source whiskey from another distillery and bottle it under their name. They built their own mash bills, their own process, their own philosophy from day one. That means they've owned every single part of their output since the first barrel went down into their warehouse. Wilderness Trail releases wheated and rye bottled in bond expressions, and you need to understand what bottled in bond actually means. It's the old regulatory standard that almost nobody uses anymore because it requires real consistency and patience. Everything has to be from one distilling season, everything has to be at least 4 years old, everything has to be bottled at exactly 100 proof, and there are no shortcuts, no blending across seasons to hide inconsistency. Some people hunt the single barrel proof releases and think that's where the magic really lives. They think that's where the real Wilderness Trail is hiding, but the bottled in bond is the controlled expression. It's the statement. It's what Wilderness Trail is saying when they decide to stake their reputation on it. Single barrel releases are explorations, but the bottled in bond is the actual mission. Buy the wheated or the rye bottled in bond, and you'll pay $50 to $60 for 100 proof bourbon with no chill filtration. What you're tasting is exactly what Wilderness Trail decided to bottle, not what just happened to be in a random barrel that day. The wheated version is creamy and approachable and vanilla forward, while the rye version is spicy and structured and shows off the rye character perfectly. Both are perfectly executed, and both prove that new distilleries can make old school bourbon without needing hype or allocation to prove it works. New Riff sits in northern Kentucky and has made an extraordinary commitment. They've made bottled in bond their core philosophy, not as a limited release or special edition, but as their baseline. That's extraordinary. A bottled in bond means it's made in one distilling season, aged a minimum of 4 years, bottled at exactly 100 proof, and made at a bonded warehouse. It's an old standard that almost nobody uses anymore, and New Riff made it their foundation. The bottled in bond is high rye bourbon with 65% corn, 30% rye, and 5% malted barley, which means you get spice, structure, and a bourbon that tastes like it was built with intention and purpose. The aging happens in new 53-gallon barrels, and the water comes from the Ohio River alluvial aquifer about 100 feet below ground, naturally filtered and at a perfect temperature. There's no chill filtration, none at all, which means everything that belongs in the bourbon stays in the bourbon. Some people chase the single barrel proof releases thinking they're the real New Riff, but those are variable and inconsistent because that's just what single barrels are. The bottled in bond is consistent. It's the same excellent expression every single time. Buy the bottled in bond at $40 to $45 and understand what high rye bourbon tastes like when a distillery has complete control of the process and decides absolutely not to compromise. The single barrels are nice if you find them, but the bottled in bond is the actual reason New Riff exists. Russell's Reserve is the whiskey label from Wild Turkey, and this is where the narrative gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't some second-tier brand. This is Wild Turkey's master distillers saying, here's what we actually believe in. Jimmy Russell is the longest-tenured active master distiller in the entire world, 65 years at the same distillery. He's been called the Buddha of bourbon and the master distiller's master distiller by his peers in the industry. He didn't just work at Wild Turkey, he shaped Wild Turkey. He shaped the entire bourbon industry for generations. His son Eddie Russell followed him, becoming an associate master distiller. So that's 3 generations of the Russell family steering Wild Turkey's direction and philosophy. Russell's Reserve single barrel at 110 proof is what happens when people like that decide to put their name on a bottle. This is not a consolation prize. This is not the bottle they make when they're not making something special. This is them saying, if you want to understand what Wild Turkey actually tastes like when we're not adding hype, here's the answer. Some people hunt the barrel-proof releases like they're lottery tickets and think the variable proof versions are somehow better just because they're different. But that's missing the point entirely. The 110 proof single barrels that show up at your local liquor store are non-chill filtered, they're bottled at a proof that actually matters, and they're consistent. They're made by professionals who have forgotten more about bourbon than most people will ever know. Here's the thing about Wild Turkey that nobody says out loud. They've never needed allocation theater. They've never needed scarcity marketing. They make good bourbon at good prices, and people have been buying it for 160 years because it works. Russell's Reserve is an extension of that philosophy. The single barrel at 110 proof is the statement, the higher proofs are explorations. So buy the 110 proof and stop waiting for something better, because better really doesn't exist. Four Roses is the bourbon equation that nobody understands until someone actually explains it to them properly. The distillery makes bourbon using 5 different yeast strains and 2 different mash bills, which gives them 10 possible flavor profiles that they can blend together. Let me break this down because it's actually revolutionary what they're doing. Mash bill B is 60% corn, 35% rye, and 5% malted barley, which is high rye, and creates a spicy, full-bodied, structured bourbon. Mash bill E is 75% corn, 20% rye, and 5% malted barley, which is lower rye and brings more corn character, brightness, and approachability. Then they layer 5 different yeast strains on top of that foundation. The V yeast creates delicate fruit notes, K yeast creates light spice and caramel, O yeast creates rich and deep fruit, Q yeast creates beautiful floral notes like lavender and honeysuckle and rose petal, and F yeast creates herbal and minty notes. When you combine 2 mash bills with 5 different yeasts, you get 10 unique recipes. Every letter means something real, and every combination is designed with intention. Some people treat the single-barrel releases like they're solving a puzzle, hunting for different recipes and yeasts, and trying to find the right barrel number and collect all 10 variations. They spend hours researching recipe codes and trade bottles with strangers on the internet. They think that's the game. But Four Roses Small Batch Select is what happens when Four Roses decides what goes into the bottle instead of leaving it up to random barrel variation. It's 104 proof, non-chill filtered, 6 to 7 years aged, and 6 different recipes blended specifically together. This is Four Roses being intentional and saying, this is the profile we want you to experience. This is us choosing balance over variation. The single barrels are nice if you find them and happen to get a good barrel, but small batch select is nice every single time, because that's the entire point and philosophy. You don't want a bourbon that's sometimes great and sometimes mediocre depending on which barrel you happen to get. You want a bourbon that tastes excellent and consistent. Small batch select is the answer, so buy it and stop hunting the lottery. Woodford Reserve is located in Versailles, Kentucky, on land where distilling actually began back in 1812. So we're talking about 200 years of history on that property. And in 1996, Brown-Forman took that land and built something that doesn't exist anywhere else in America. Woodford Reserve is one of the only triple distilled bourbons made in the United States, and they do it not because they're trying to be fancy, but because they chose to do it the Irish way. Most bourbon distilleries use a single column still and 1 distillation run because you get faster production, more yield, and lower costs. Woodford decided that approach was fundamentally stupid. They use 3 custom copper pot stills that were built in Scotland by Forsyths: the beer still, the high wine still, and the spirit still, and the whiskey goes through all 3 of them. This triple distillation creates a whiskey that tastes completely different than standard bourbon. It's fruity, it's layered, it's refined, it's citrus bright in a way that bourbon shouldn't be, but somehow absolutely is. The fermentation happens in 8 cypress wood tanks that hold 7,500 gallons each, and the fermentation is open top and slow. The barrel aging happens in temperature-controlled warehouses where every barrel is hand-selected, and master distiller Chris Morris and his team taste every single expression before it gets bottled and released. Every year, Woodford releases a Master's Collection expression, and sometimes it's a port cask finish, sometimes it's Madeira, sometimes it's cognac cask. These are expensive, allocated to fine dining and whiskey auctions, the bottles people talk about and hunt. But these are explorations and experiments. The Master's Collection is Woodford showing what they're capable of. But the core Woodford Reserve bourbon is what you should actually buy. It's 6 to 7 years aged, mid-range rye in the mash bill, perfectly balanced, no experiments, no finishes, just Woodford saying, here's what we believe in. This is what we've committed to. This is the mission. Bartenders reach for core Woodford when they're making a bourbon cocktail that actually matters. When someone orders a Manhattan or a whiskey sour and the bartender cares about the outcome, they reach for core Woodford. The Master's Collection expressions are nice if someone someone else is buying, but the core bourbon is what professionals trust and stake their reputation on. Belle Meade is the Tennessee-sourced bourbon that doesn't get the hype it deserves, and their cask strength reserve is their statement. It's 7 to 11 years, aged, high-rye sourced bourbon, bottled at cask strength, which means 110 to 120 proof depending on the barrel. There's no chill filtration, so every drop stays in the bottle. It's a small batch of only 7 barrels, and yes, that scarcity is real, but it's not marketing-driven. It's just what happens when you commit to excellence and refuse to compromise on quality. The bottle costs $60 to $70. You can actually buy it without begging for allocation. It's not a release calendar game. It's just a bourbon that tastes like someone knew exactly what they wanted and built it with intention and purpose. The flavor profile is rich with spice from the rye, deep oak influence, caramel, and vanilla. The mouthfeel is full-bodied and chewy because the cask strength proof brings everything forward with intensity. This is a bourbon that proves you don't need allocation theater to make something worth collecting. Belle Meade Cask Strength Reserve is proof that actual quality speaks for itself through flavor, through consistency, through the fact that it tastes the same excellent way in every single bottle. Bardstown is the newer Kentucky distillery that made a choice that almost nobody else would make, and that choice was to spend 6 years building their own still. 6 years. They didn't immediately start bottling sourced bourbon from other distilleries and pretending it was theirs. They didn't chase quick revenue. They waited, they built, they tested, and they committed to doing it right from the very start. In 2023, they released the Origin series, and this is their first 100% estate distilled bourbon. That means every single drop was made by them in their facility with no sourcing, no mysteries, no blending whiskey from somewhere else and hoping nobody notices. This is what happens when a distillery says everything I make is worth showing you. Everything. Before the Origin series, Bardstown was blending sourced bourbon from everywhere. Heaven Hill, Wild Turkey, Buffalo Trace, and the blends were good, but you couldn't tell what you were actually getting. You couldn't taste Bardstown's philosophy because Bardstown didn't have their own philosophy yet. They had other people's whiskey. Origin series answered that question completely. This is Bardstown. This is what we believe. This is what we can do with our own hands, our own still, our own commitment to the craft. Buy the Origin series and understand what Bardstown actually tastes like when they're not hiding behind sourced whiskey and mystique. Elijah Craig is from Heaven Hill, which has the second largest bourbon stockpile in the entire world. The master distillers there could make absolutely anything. They could chase allocated, they could chase hype, they could do fancy releases and collector's bottles for days. Instead, they make Elijah Craig Small Batch for $28 to $30. It's 8 to 12 years aged at 94 proof with warm spice and subtle smoke, and hand-selected barrels blended for balance. That's it. No mystery, no allocation, no release calendar games, no secondary market nonsense. Elijah Craig barrel proof exists and it's allocated and it's hunted. But small batch is what Heaven Hill decided to keep in production and keep available and keep proving that excellence doesn't require scarcity. This is the bottle that teaches you the difference between marketing and craft, between status and substance, between what sounds impressive and what tastes excellent. Reverend Elijah Craig is credited with being the first distiller to age whiskey in charred oak barrels, and he's the reason this entire industry exists. He discovered that you could char the inside of a barrel and pour whiskey into it, and the whiskey would absorb the flavor and the color and become something absolutely magical. That discovery 200 years ago created bourbon as we know it. His name on a bottle means something real. The small batch respects that history by being consistently excellent. Not exciting, not innovative, just excellent. That's the legacy. That's what Heaven Hill understood. Excellence doesn't need gimmicks or allocation games. It just needs commitment. Across all 10 distilleries, one truth stands out completely. Bourbon greatness is not built on allocation and rarity. It's built on consistency and commitment. The weeded softness of Weller, the spice of New Riff, the balance of Four Roses, the refinement of Woodford, and the heritage of Elijah Craig don't matter because they're rare or hard to find. They matter because they're excellent every single time you pour them. Subscribe and drop a like if this changed how you think about your next bourbon purchase, and comment with the bourbon you regret buying or the bottle you wish you'd known about earlier. Thanks for drinking seriously.